what brings them all together and makes them play in sync and make it sound good. So that is, our executive functioning skills are like the conductor of our brain's orchestra. We're going to go through what each of the skills are. These are roughly in the order that they develop. When you are born, you do not have all of these skills. They develop over your lifetime. The first one is called response inhibition. A simple way of putting it is response inhibition is impulse control, the ability to be able to pause and think before you act, or pause and think before you say something. Working memory is the ability to hold information in your mind while you're manipulating it. So an example of this would be remembering a phone number while you're also trying to dial it. That's a really simple example. Working memory comes into play a lot, and we're going to be talking about working memory a lot tonight. Emotional control is the next one. This one's pretty self-explanatory, but it's your ability to keep your emotions in check in order to continue on and achieve your goals and not let those emotions get in the way of what you're trying to accomplish. The next one is flexibility. This is the ability to change your plans if your first plan isn't working. Sustained attention is again a pretty self-explanatory one. Your ability to stay focused on something for an extended period of time without getting distracted. Task initiation, this is the one I personally am the worst at. This is all about being able to get started on things in an efficient, timely fashion without procrastinating. So those of you that are fellow procrastinators out there, task initiation might be an area of growth for you. Planning and prioritization is another one that's kind of self-explanatory, but this is all about being able to create a plan, make sure you have all the different steps in there, and then also be able to prioritize what should come first, what's most important, and what you can save for later. Organization is the ability to keep track of information and materials. So there's kind of external organization in terms of where you keep your stuff or how you keep your office organized. And then there's also internal organization of being able to kind of categorize things in your mind, keep a story straight, tell it in order. Time management. This is one that a lot of students struggle with. The ability to estimate how much time something is going to take and be able to stay within a time limit without going way over. Goal-directed persistence is the ability to stick to a goal and follow through without getting distracted until you've met that goal. And then the very last executive functioning skill to develop is called metacognition. And this is your ability to kind of self-reflect, be able to think back on a situation or something that you've done, something that you've produced, think about what went well, what didn't go well, what would you change next time. It's kind of thinking about your own thinking. Any questions about those skills before I keep going?
No questions yet.
All right, perfect. Oops. So who has trouble with executive functioning? First, all children and teenagers have trouble with executive functioning. Typically, these skills don't fully develop in your brain until between 25 and 30 years old. So even if a student has no diagnosis of ADHD or an executive functioning deficit, they're still going to have trouble with some of these skills as they are developing and growing. Kids that have ADHD are going to have more deficits in executive functioning than children who don't. And oftentimes trouble with executive functioning comes along with specific learning disorders. And so this is a really pertinent topic for the population that we work with here at Groves. Many of our students have learning disorders and or ADHD. Executive functioning can play direct and indirect roles in the classroom. So a direct example would be, can a student sit still? Are they focusing on what they need to? Are they following rules? Can they be flexible and think about another person's perspective? And then an indirect effect of having trouble with executive functioning or being good at it is liking school and being motivated. So I really like this quote down here. I think it captures really well how executive functioning can affect students over time. So children with really good executive functioning skills and that learn more easily are likely to enjoy their school experience, feel optimistic about their own potential, they're excited to learn, they get along with teachers and peers. Students that have difficulty with executive functioning may interfere with their own or other kids' learning, and then that starts to lead to possible behavior problems. Sometimes difficulty with executive functioning, actually I would say a lot of times, difficulty with executive functioning is misconstrued as defiance, when in fact a lot of times it's an inability to complete the task without support. So having difficulty with these skills really over time starts to affect a student's attitude towards school, and it can also affect teachers or school personnel's attitudes toward that student. So that's kind of how it affects learning and academics in general.
All right, we're going to jump in now to how executive functioning deficits can impact writing. And I'm also going to start with a quote here. I'm just going to read it to you. It says, "Text production requires the writer to filter one's thoughts, inhibit distractions, sustain attention, plan what to write, organize the ideas, and have cognitive flexibility to switch gears and adapt to change perspectives and demands of the writing task. Written expression combines the demands of several executive functioning skills because the writer not only has to generate and organize ideas, but also translate them into print while keeping in mind the ideas to be recorded." So this quote just does a really good job of kind of showing and explaining how many different executive functioning skills are at play when we write. So as you can see, there's a ton of them: organizing, cognitive flexibility. And so it is a very complex task. And to individuals who don't have any significant executive functioning deficits, you know, writing can come really naturally and really easily. And we just sit down, we write what we want to write, and then we're done with it, right? But for students that struggle with executive functioning, it's very complex, and it can be really difficult for them. Cool. I don't know if my remote access is working. Megan, do you want to? Wait, let's see if it'll work now. Okay, I think it might be working now. Okay. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about how age can play a role as well. So when younger students are starting to write, they're really focused on the motor movements, the transcription of the letters, putting letters together to make a word. And doing that, you don't necessarily need a ton of executive functioning skills, right? You're focused more on the motor piece, copying things down. And it's not till students get a little bit older where the focus switches from that like physical motor writing to more of the development of ideas, so organizing your thoughts, producing full sentences. That's when you're going to see executive functioning play more of a role. So in younger students, you might not notice the deficits in their writing, but as they get older, those might start to emerge. All right, so to write, we need almost all of our executive functioning skills. These 8 are the top 8 that we for sure need, that they're the most important for writing. And I'm going to kind of go into greater depth on all of these in my upcoming slides, but I'm just going to kind of give you a brief overview right now. So working memory is so important for writing. As Megan was saying, it's where you temporarily store and manipulate information, and then so that you can use it. And so if you think about writing, you know, we need to think about what we're going to write, plan it out in our head, and we kind of need to keep it in that working memory so that we can then transcribe it. So working memory is really important, and I'm going to talk more about that on my next slide. We obviously need sustained attention to write. If you have to sit down to write, you need to be able to attend to the task, attend to the topic. And if students are getting really distracted, they might get up and leave their writing assignment. And when they come back, they might have totally lost their train of thought. And so that can lead to some really choppy writing. It can be hard to follow. And then also it's going to take those students a lot longer to complete writing tasks because they're going to have to kind of reacclimate and refocus onto the task, and that takes time. You need your planning and prioritization skills as well. So if we think about writing, you need to sit down, you need to make a plan of what to write so it makes sense for your reader. And I'm going to talk about that more as well a little later on. Organization as well. You know, if we just sit down and write, you know, whatever comes to our mind, it's going to be very disorganized, right? We need to be able to figure out an organizational system for our writing, organize it so it makes sense to our audience. Time management is also important. So if we have an assignment due at midnight the next day, we're going to need to be able to estimate how long something's going to take. You know, pick some time of the day to complete it. For a lot of students, I've noticed that they often will underestimate how long something will take. So let's say, for example, they have a 2-page paper, they might think, oh, that's going to take 20 minutes, right? And then they're forced to kind of rush through it because they didn't leave enough time for themselves. But I've also seen that some students can also overestimate how long a writing task will take, right? So they have a 2-page paper, it's going to take all night, it's going to take 6 hours. And that can lead to some anxiety about it and some task avoidance. And so kind of working with your student to really estimate the actual amount of time it's going to take so they don't get super overwhelmed is really important to keep in mind as well. Flexibility. You need to be flexible with your writing because you're going to receive criticism from teachers or peers, and you need to be able to kind of take that and be flexible and change any errors and revise your work. Goal-directed persistence. When you write a paper or paragraph, the goal is to complete it, to do your best work, to turn it in on time. And so you have to be able to see that end goal and be able to work towards that. And then finally, metacognition is also really important. You know, being aware of your past mistakes and then, you know, using what you've learned in your next writing. And also kind of being aware of your audience too. That's really important for writing. So a lot of executive functioning skills you need to be a successful writer. Okay, I'm going to dig a little deeper into working memory. So let's think about when we sit down to write. We need our working memory to be able to recall all of the spelling rules we've learned, the sentence structures we know, the punctuation rules. We need to be keeping all of this in our working memory as we are writing. So we have to keep that in our working memory. We have to keep in our working memory how to transcribe letters. And we have to do this all while holding the ideas in our head, formulating a sentence, and then going down to write it. So there's a lot going on in your working memory when you're doing this. Students with working memory deficits, they have a limited capacity for their working memory. And so they don't have as much room basically for all of these things to be happening. And so what we see happen a lot is students may forget what they're writing kind of in the middle of a sentence. So a student may verbalize, I want to write this, and they'll say the sentence, they'll go to write it, and after a few words, they might look up and say, oh, wait, I forgot what I was going to say. Because their working memory is really being used up on, you know, the spelling, the punctuation, and those lower level skills. And they don't have as much capacity for those higher level skills like developing ideas, choosing interesting vocab, creating complex sentences. So working memory is so important for writing. It plays a huge role. All right, let's talk about planning. So when we sit down to write, you know, we typically will brainstorm our ideas, we'll get them down on paper, we'll maybe kind of organize them, we'll make a nice plan for an outline. Students that struggle with this might not really know how to do this, and they'll likely skip this step. But when they skip that step, that leads to, you know, a lack of flow in their paper. If you haven't spent that time brainstorming and organizing, you might be jumping around a lot. So it's going to be kind of hard to read. And then also it'll lead to shorter paragraphs and shorter papers. So if you're not able to brainstorm and get all your ideas out, you might just write down the first few things that come to your mind, and then that will be much shorter than we would expect. And then thinking about prioritizing too, when we write, we have to figure out, the most important details that we want to include. And we have to kind of figure out which ones we need to leave out, which ones aren't important to our topic. And so students that struggle with kind of pulling out those key details and prioritizing, their paper or their paragraph might include things that we wouldn't expect. It might include little details that aren't important to the overall topic. All right, organization kind of goes hand in hand with planning. So, you brainstorm, you plan, and then you kind of organize your thoughts, maybe sequentially. Maybe you would organize them, by category, so it makes sense to your reader. So students that struggle with this organization, they might have their sentences completely out of order in their paragraph, and it might be really hard to follow. They might be jumping around. They might say one thing about one topic and then jump to the next topic and then go back to the other topic, and it can be hard to follow. At the sentence level, you can also identify some mistakes too. So if we think about organizing a sentence, you have to organize it in the correct order for it to make sense. And so students that struggle with organization might be making those sentence structure errors at the more basic sentence level as well. All right. Oh.
Looks like we have a question coming in about this. It says, how early can you figure out if it's executive functioning that is impacting the writing?
That's a good question. I don't know if there's necessarily like a certain age that you can figure that out. But when students start kind of writing at the sentence and paragraph level, that's definitely a time where we can kind of analyze the writing and kind of dig a little deeper to see kind of what patterns are we seeing and kind of try to figure out why those errors are happening. Megan, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, sorry, I skipped slides.
You're good.
Yeah, the only other thing I was going to add is this is where psychoeducational or neuropsychological evaluations are really helpful and important tools for students that are having difficulty, because they really help us to decipher why some of the difficulties are happening. So a lot of times by the time a student is coming in for an evaluation, their caregivers already know that they're having difficulty and what areas they're having difficulty in. But then those assessments really help us try to dig in deep and see, is it a vocabulary issue? Is it an underlying language issue? Is it a cognitive issue? Is there something going on cognitively? Or is there some executive functioning or ADHD happening that's affecting it? And it can also be multiple of those things. So I would say in terms of how early can you know, I would say it would be around the same time that you could go in and get a neuropsychological or psychoeducational assessment. And usually the earliest that they want to do that is like 7-ish, both for executive functioning and for academic skills. Sometimes in really severe cases, they'll diagnose ADD or ADHD earlier than that. But typically it's around that time that is kind of the starting point for where you can do an assessment like that.
Awesome, great question. All right, so I'm going to show you a few examples of some students' work that struggled with specifically like planning, organization, and attention. So this student specifically struggled with planning and attention. And so I evaluated this student a little over a year ago, and whenever we evaluate students for speech and language, we want to take a look at their writing and see how they're doing with their paragraph writing. And so I just prompted the student with, write a paragraph about yourself. And so then I turned away from him and I went to sit at my computer and kind of gave him some space. And this is what he wrote. He wrote, I like music, art, and painting. I like sports cars, racing, eating good food, trying new things, eating, have fun, watch movies, games. So this student really struggled with attention. Every 30 seconds, he would look up and ask me a question or tell me a story or look around the room and, say a funny joke. So he really struggled to stay focused on the writing task. And you can see that, his sentences aren't complete. He's repeating himself. So he wasn't attending to the task, and he did not do any planning at all. He just kind of jumped in and started writing. And you can see that really impacted his ability to create a cohesive paragraph. Oops. Okay, here's another example. The student specifically struggled with planning and prioritizing. So again, I assessed the student a little over a year ago, asked him to write a paragraph. His prompt was write about your summer. And he wrote, this summer I went to Chicago 3 times with my mom, went to visit my family for my great uncle's birthday. The second time was to visit him in hospice. And the third was for his funeral. On the third time, we came home with a puppy that we met there. So this student sat quietly and didn't write anything for about 5 minutes. And I went over there and kind of checked in with him, and he mentioned, he said, you know, I have no idea where to start. I don't know what to write. So he was having a lot of trouble with planning and initiating the task. He did not know where to start. He didn't know really how to brainstorm or plan. And so I helped him out, and I wrote down some ideas of what he could include in his paragraph. Then he was able to get started, but he struggled to prioritize. So the topic was write about your summer, and he really honed in on this Chicago trip and that part of his summer, right? He didn't include anything about what he did with friends or who he saw or the weather or anything else. He really honed in on this and had trouble kind of prioritizing the bigger picture. This student had difficulty with organization as well as planning. And so again, I evaluated this student. I asked her to write me a paragraph. She wanted to write me a paragraph about a time she got hurt. And so this is what she wrote. She wrote, I was dizzy. I didn't know what was going on. Then that morning, was so excited to go to my cousin's house. When we got there, we played a game. Then I did a cartwheel down the stairs. So after she wrote this, I read it and I told her I was a little confused. And she then described the story to me. And if we take the first 2 sentences, I was dizzy, I didn't know what was going on, and we put those at the end of the paragraph, it makes much more sense, right? So if we started it with, that morning I was so excited to go to my cousin's house. When we got there, we played a game, then I did a cartwheel down the stairs. I was dizzy, I didn't know what was going on. That makes much more sense. I understand it a lot better now. So working on that sequencing and knowing how to really organize and order your paragraph, that is going to be helpful for her. All right, let's talk about flexibility next. Again, flexibility is being able to change your plans, change your mistakes, adapt when you need to. And this can be hard for some students. So if, let's say, a student completes a paragraph, turns it in, and the teacher has some feedback for them and some criticism and some things to change, this might be really hard for a student to accept. They might even have maybe an emotional reaction, an emotional outburst when a teacher or adult is helping them revise their work. Emotional control, Meghan mentioned, is another executive functioning skill. And it kind of goes hand in hand with flexibility. If you're having trouble being flexible, but someone is kind of making you be flexible, it can be really difficult. And then when these students do revise, they often have trouble kind of revising more of the content, and they stick more to those lower level writing skills, and they might edit more for grammar, for spelling, and things like that. All right, metacognition. This again is being aware of yourself, being aware of your knowledge, your actions, and kind of self-reflecting on what you know. And so students that struggle with this, they might have some trouble kind of identifying and correcting their own errors. They may be unaware of the strategies that they've learned, and they might have difficulty then applying them when they need them. Thinking about their audience might be tough too. They might have difficulty kind of putting themselves in their reader's shoes to really think about the audience. And they can have difficulty learning from past mistakes and reflecting on that. Okay, so we know that executive functioning can impact writing. So what do we do about it? How do we help? So what the research is telling us is that these students with executive functioning deficits really need some explicit, clear instruction on the steps of the writing process. It needs to be guided with a teacher or a clinician, and it needs to be really repetitive. We can't just instruct the student once or twice and expect them to be able to use that outline and be able to use the tools we've taught them. It needs to be very repetitive. They need that structure over and over again for it to really sink in. The goal of this repetitive guided instruction is really to have it become more automatic for them to do these things and use these tools. And overall, that'll kind of free up some working memory space. And we know working memory is so important for writing. If we can give them a little more capacity, they can focus on other writing pieces instead. So giving them that repeated instruction and that guidance is going to be really helpful.
Just a quick add to that, the reason that it frees up space in their working memory is that if the student has not yet really mastered the writing process, while they're writing, they are both trying to monitor the process of writing and what they need to do next for the assignment, while they're also trying to monitor the content that they're writing, the facts they're including, how they're sequencing it. So if we can make this first part more automatic for them and more routine so that they don't have to keep that process in their mind, they can really focus more on the content piece.
Absolutely. All right. So I'm going to kind of go into different examples of how this will look. So I'm going to start at the sentence level. It's really important to first start at the sentence level with students who need that. If we are going to ask a student to write a paragraph and we want complex sentences and compound sentences and varied sentence structures, we need to teach them that first if that's something they're having trouble with. So at the sentence level, doing specific activities and teaching them specific strategies about how to produce complex sentences is really important. At Groves, we use the Writing Revolution curriculum. It's an amazing curriculum for students. I have the website on this slide, so when you get it tomorrow, if you want to take a peek at it, feel free. And all of these activities that are listed here, the Writing Revolution explains in depth and has various templates that we use with our students. And so kind of teaching the students these strategies, again, the point of this is so that they can take the strategy with them and use it on their own. And that also frees up more working memory space if they're not having to think about and kind of try to recall how to make a complex sentence. If they're just going to, if they can use these strategies every day when they're writing, it's going to be really beneficial for them. So here are some examples. We have combining simple sentences. I'm going to show you that on the next slide. Expanding sentences by adding WH information. I'll also show you that on the next slide. Teaching students how to use different conjunctions. So the coordinating conjunctions like because and but, and then also subordinating conjunctions like when, while, after, even though, using appositives, unscrambling sentences, turning fragments into sentences. These are all really good activities for these students. So here are a couple of examples. So the one on the left is combining sentences. So we tell students, okay, we have two simple sentences. We could make a complex sentence by putting them together. And how we do that is by removing repeated information and adding a conjunction. So for number one, it says, Helen Keller's family was able to afford a private teacher. Not all families of disabled children can afford private teachers. So the student then would look for repeated information, right? I see private teacher twice on here, so we don't need it twice. And then we can use a conjunction to combine it. And so then hopefully the student would write, Helen Keller's family was able to afford a private teacher, but not all families of disabled children can. Something along those lines. So kind of teaching them to remove that repeated information, use those conjunctions. The next strategy is my absolute favorite. Students really pick up on this one. It's very easy for them to kind of wrap their heads around. So this is expanding simple sentences by adding WH information. So this example I have up here, it says the directions are to expand the kernel sentence. We call it the kernel sentence because if you think of a little piece of popcorn, it's very small, it's very boring, but when it pops, or when you expand your sentence, it's much more interesting and bigger and better. So this kernel is a storm surprised people. that's a full sentence, but it's simple, it's boring. How can we make it more interesting? You could add when, where, and why. So the student would jot down when, they would maybe jot down like last week. Where? In Minnesota. Why? Because it was sunny all day. So then you would take those notes and you would take that kernel sentence, and you would put it all together to create a sentence like, last week, a storm surprised people in Minnesota because it had been sunny all day. And I've noticed with students that they can generalize this really well. So I've moved away from using this template with a lot of my students and just having a visual of the WH words out. And when they write a short sentence, I may just point to it and be like, why don't you pick 2 of these to add to it? Or they might just be doing it on their own now. So this one is really, really easy for kids to wrap their head around. And it's really, really useful. All right, one more example here. This is a coordinating conjunctions activity to teach the conjunctions. So this is about driverless cars. So we have the same sentence stem. Driverless cars will be useful. And then we add a conjunction, a different conjunction to that same stem. So driverless cars will be useful because, driverless cars will be useful but, and driverless cars will be useful so. And this teaches them that when they use these conjunctions, it really can change the meaning of the sentence. It can add a lot of information and detail to their work.
Oops, sorry. The other thing that's cool about this, which I will get into when I talk about executive functioning and reading and how these exercises we're talking about really help with reading as well. But all the writing revolution activities are designed to be paired with something that the student has read. So for this activity, I would assume the student would have read an article about driverless cars and that new technology. And this is great for comprehension as well as learning the writing piece, because they have to look at this sentence from 3 different angles and talk about why they would be useful, what's maybe not so useful about them, and then they also have to show cause and effect using so. So they have to look at the same piece of information from 3 different angles. So that really helps with the deep comprehension of the material as well.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Okay, let's talk a little bit about how we would help these students at the paragraph level. So at the paragraph level, it's really important to model and teach brainstorming. So often students will come and they'll have something to write and they won't even know where to start at all, because it might be overwhelming to get a topic like driverless cars, for example. If they had to write about that, they might not know where to start. They might not know what's important. And so just getting all of our ideas out on paper is something that they need to kind of see happen. And so modeling that is really important. So I have a visual over here. A student and I were writing about Thanksgiving. And I just said, all right, let's get all of our ideas out. I'll go first. I always think of family when I think of Thanksgiving. And then we went back and forth and we jotted down all the ideas that came to our head about Thanksgiving. So modeling that is really important. After you brainstorm, a really good way to organize that makes sense for students is to kind of categorize them in colors. You have all these ideas, right? If we just started talking about them if we started writing at the beginning, you know, I'm with my family on Thanksgiving, and then we jump to food, it wouldn't make sense. So kind of explaining to them, like, we need to categorize it and organize it so we're not jumping around. And so kind of modeling how I am finding similarities between these things. So I'm going to highlight all the food in orange. So I might model that, and then I might have them pick out another color and ask them, what are some other similarities you see among all of your ideas? And then they can kind of highlight those until we have, you know, 3 or 4 categories for our paragraph. So once we have that, we can get our outline out. And then what I did here was I took those 4 categories that we brainstormed and I transferred the colors onto the outline. And then we just transferred all of our brainstormed ideas onto this outline. And it's organized. It makes sense for the students since it's color coded. But the main takeaway is that students need an outline of some sort. It doesn't have to be this one. It doesn't have to be color coded like this. This is just a kind of a cool example I wanted to share with you guys. but just using an outline is very important. It's going to help with organization, obviously. It's going to help with planning. It's going to help with working memory too. So if a student doesn't have to keep all of these brainstormed ideas in their head, if they can have it on paper, then they don't have to be worrying about that and keeping that in their working memory as they're writing, because they know they have their ideas there. So it frees up a lot of working memory space. So any outline that you use with a student is going to be great. This is another idea for how to help at the paragraph level. This is a backwards planning sheet, it's called. And so I'm going to kind of explain it to you and break it down. So backwards planning is basically visualizing what you want your outcome to be and then making a plan from there. And so with this sheet, if we have this worksheet out, the 3 middle boxes would be blank, but I filled them in for us so I can explain it to you guys. But we would start over here with number 1. So you're going to start over here in this column. And the instructions say, see ahead, visualize the future. What will this look like when I'm done? And so we've kind of written a little fake paragraph, and it has a title, a name, and a date. It's indented. It's about, 7-8 lines long. This is what we want our paragraph to look like. And we're going to go over here to number 2, and the instructions say to break it down and plan it out. So this is where you're going to kind of write down all the steps of the writing process. So first we're going to brainstorm, then we're going to sort our ideas into categories, put the categories into notes on our outline, write a topic sentence, etc. Then you're going to go over here to number 3. You're going to write down all the materials you will need for this activity. So, pencil, outline, markers, computer, printer, your checklist. And then you have this nice plan laid out for you. So then you can gather your materials, you can follow the steps. When you get done, down here, number 6 says, does this look like I expected? So you're going to take your paragraph and you're going to compare it to this column right here. Does my paragraph match this one? And a student might realize like, oh, I forgot my title, or I forgot to indent, because they're comparing what they wanted it to look like with what their work actually looks like. So this is kind of a cool process here. This can be used with any type of long-term assignment, long-term project, anything that's kind of overwhelming the student. This is a good planning sheet for that. All right. When we think about editing and revising, using checklists is a really good idea with these students. However, we can't just give the student a checklist and expect them to know kind of how to use it and what we mean by these words on it. We're going to have to really model and teach and do it repeatedly with the student. And so when I do this with students, I'll sit down with them, we'll read each sentence out loud, we'll pause after every sentence, and I'll kind of go through the checklist with them. They'll listen for anything that sounds kind of funny. I'll prompt them to pick better vocabulary words, and we'll kind of do it together so they kind of know what I mean by all of these words on the checklist. Another really cool feature for this too, if a student's revising their work on their own, having the computer read it to them. So a text-to-speech feature, you can highlight the paragraph or the paper and it reads it to them so that they can really listen and really realize, like, does that sound good? Do I need to change something? So that's a good option if they don't have a parent or teacher to help them with that. So let's talk about some of the accommodations and modifications that can be utilized in the classroom or at home. So for students that struggle with writing due to their executive functioning deficits, it's going to be a good idea to reduce the length of written assignments if possible, or extend the time to complete them. So with attention, it's going to take them longer because they might be getting up more frequently to go do something else, or they might have trouble really focusing in on the work. Same with working memory deficits. If you are forgetting what you were writing and you have to kind of reprocess and re-recall it, it's going to take you longer to write it. So either reducing the length or giving the student more time is going to be helpful. Breaking down writing tasks into smaller increments is a really good idea as well. This is something an adult will probably have to help the child do. So for example, if they have a paper due on Friday, maybe on Monday they'll brainstorm and organize. Maybe on Tuesday, they'll do their outline, write their intro, or write their topic sentence and their conclusion sentence. Wednesday, maybe they'll expand it. Thursday, they'll revise and edit it. And by Friday, they'll be able to turn it in. So helping them break it down so it's not so overwhelming for them. And then also making personal due dates too for each of those steps, and writing them in a planner will be helpful. Building in breaks when writing is also a good idea. You know, if a student struggles with multiple of these executive functioning skills, writing can be really overwhelming and just kind of stressful. So if we can break it up, build in breaks, that's going to be important. Obviously, removing distractions is going to be helpful. And then allowing students to have an outline and giving them those direct and repetitive instructions and models is also going to be great. All right. Does anyone have any questions right now about executive functioning and writing and how it's impacted, or about the interventions at all?
There is one that came in from Brianna, and it says, I anticipate this being addressed later in the workshop. I am a parent of a 3rd grader with ADHD, learning disabilities in reading and writing, so dysgraphia and dyslexia, trying to do my best, but with full distance learning. So looking for strategies to use at home to make school less frustrating and less of the I hate school, I give up kind of, you know, mentality and moments, and piling up assignments and writing specifically.
Absolutely. So I hope that some of these modifications and accommodations can be helpful to you at home. Also, Megan and I have a lot of knowledge too of other little tricks that we know to help different things that are affected by ADHD at home. And so we're happy to kind of send you a private email tomorrow, kind of going a little deeper into what you can do at home for other ADHD and executive functioning things that are impacting him.
All right, well, that was the only question so far.
Okay. We're going to move into how executive functioning affects reading. So these are all the different executive functioning skills you need for reading successfully. I'm going to go into some of the more complex ones in greater detail on the following slides, but I'll give you a quick rundown, kind of like Jeannie did. So for response inhibition here, you need to be able to inhibit irrelevant or unimportant information while you're reading. So you need to be able to not only ignore any distractions in your environment while you're reading, but you also need to be able to decipher what are the really important pieces from what I'm reading that I need to pay attention to, and what can I kind of let go. I'm going to go into working memory in a lot of detail on the next slide, so I'm going to skip that one for now. Emotional control goes into reading if it's a student that doesn't enjoy reading or it's really difficult for them. They need to manage their emotions both kind of before they start a reading task and then also while they're reading. Flexibility comes into play with reading when they come across words that have multiple meanings. Non-literal language, they need to be flexible in that interpretation and realize, okay, it could be this, but actually the real underlying meaning is this. And then also being able to take another person's perspective. That's part of flexibility as well. Realizing that the character might have different experiences or different feelings than I do. Sustained attention, of course, you cannot comprehend anything if you're not attending to it, right? So students need to attend to what they're reading long enough for it to be able to be committed to their working memory and then in turn their longer term memory. Planning and time management comes into play in terms of reading assignments, especially long-term ones. If it's a novel that they're reading that they have to do a book report on, they need to think about how many pages do I need to read tonight? Do I have enough time to get through everything? Goal-directed persistence comes into play because, again, reading can be difficult and they need to keep the end goal in mind. I need to finish this assignment tonight, or I'm going to be doing something fun after this, so I want to get my work done. I know that I need to understand this material for the test, so even though this isn't my favorite thing to do, I'm going to do it. And then metacognition comes into play with reading too, because a lot of us don't necessarily think about it, but we're constantly assessing, am I understanding this? Have I been paying attention? A lot of times when I'm reading, I'll realize I read a whole page, totally wasn't focused on what I was reading. I need to go back. If a student doesn't have those self-monitoring skills, they might just continue on and not assess whether they're understanding or attending to what they need to be. Working memory, again, just like with writing, plays a huge role in reading for multiple reasons. So the first one is a student needs to be decoding the words, retrieving the meanings of those words, comparing it to the text they've already read, and anticipating what's coming next, all at the same time while they're reading. That is extremely difficult for a student that has trouble with working memory. While we're reading, we also need to hold multiple representations of the same letter sounds in our brain and decide which one pertains to the word we're decoding. And that's really difficult for students with working memory deficits and dyslexia because it takes them longer to decode. So they have to keep those sounds in their mind for longer. And then as sentences become longer and more complex, they need to hold that information in their mind while they're analyzing it for their meaning. Students also have to use working memory to create a mental image while they're reading. They need to read, understand, and then create that picture all at the same time. Inferencing requires working memory, being able to attend to the information and also think about my own past experiences in order to kind of draw a conclusion about what might be happening if it's not directly stated. Using context clues requires working memory, attending to those clues while also coming up with a possible meaning for a word that I don't know. Answering comprehension questions. I need to remember the question long enough to be able to go back and find the information and answer that question. And then on top of this, if a student also has trouble with processing speed and it takes them longer to process information, they have to hold it in their working memory that much longer. So there's a lot of underlying skills with reading related to working memory that we don't always think about if we are a person that reading comes easily to. But those are a lot of the different underlying skills that are involved. Here's an example of how working memory can affect reading along with flexibility. Both of these sentences mean the same. And we can say, it was raining, but we went swimming anyway. Or we could say, although the weather was not cooperating, we decided to enjoy our time in the pool since it's not every day that we get to go swimming. So you could see where the second one, even though the meaning is the same as the first one, it's a lot more words, it's in kind of a different order. The student needs to be able to read that sentence, hold it in their mind, and interpret it all at the same time. And if they were looking at both of these sentences, they'd need to understand that they mean the same thing, but you can say it in two different ways, and that requires flexibility as well. So one of the things that really helps with reading comprehension that isn't on the next slide, but that I wanted to draw attention to, is the fact that oftentimes difficulty understanding single sentence structures is a huge contributor to reading comprehension. So this longer, more complex sentence that's on the bottom has some complicated conjunctions in it, although it's phrased in kind of a different order and it's a lot longer. If we can work with students to break down and manipulate these longer, more complex sentence structures, and they are getting used to writing them on their own, it's going to be much easier for them to process them efficiently. They'll become more automatic in breaking them down and understanding them. And that really helps their reading. So that's where the Writing Revolution sentence level activities is a huge bang for your buck, because not only are you targeting writing, you are also making it easier for them to manipulate and understand these more complex sentences, which makes reading comprehension a lot easier as well. Some of the ways that we can help students with reading. The first one is exposing the students to information in other ways before they start reading about that information. A lot of kids with executive functioning difficulties have a really hard time reading and producing that mental image while they're reading at the same time. If we can show them a video that gives them a lot of the same information and then have them read about it, they've got a picture in their mind that they didn't have to create, that they can refer back to and help, and it really helps them understand the material. So for kids with executive functioning difficulties, I recommend breaking the rule where you have to read the book before you watch the movie. I would do it the other way around. Have them watch the movie. They already know the story. If they like the movie, it's probably going to be a motivator for wanting to read the book. And they are much more likely to understand that text as they're reading because they have a picture in their mind to refer to. Another example of this would be like high school students, if they're getting into more complex material about a history, maybe they're talking about a war, have them read a graphic novel that has tons of pictures before they read their textbook information. Or if it's the Revolutionary War, have them watch The Patriot with Mel Gibson. They'll get an idea of the weapons, the clothing, the time period, what everything looked like, so that when they're then reading that textbook, they've got an image in their mind to refer to. The next one is explicit instruction in annotating and note-taking. Because these students oftentimes have trouble with working memory, we want them taking notes along the way that they can refer back to versus having to remember an entire chapter of information without having that written help. This is also a really good way to assess comprehension, because with note-taking, you have to take a chunk of information and be able to kind of summarize it and put it in your own words. And if you don't understand that information, you're not going to be able to do that. So whoever's working with the student and teaching note-taking can really get a good idea of, are they understanding this or not? Modeling, stopping periodically and asking yourself, am I understanding? Am I attending to this? That's a metacognitive skill that a lot of students don't have. So this is where we have to model it for the student, model thinking out loud. So an example of this is we read aloud in our summer class that we teach, and I co-teach it with another person, and we will actually take turns raising our hand in front of the kids and saying, excuse me, I lost my spot, can we go back a little bit? Or, excuse me, can we talk about this word? I don't really know what it means. So that they're realizing that they need to stop, they need to assess their understanding, and that it's okay if they lost their spot or they don't understand. They just need to then go back. Studying unfamiliar vocabulary ahead of time before a student starts reading is huge, because then when they come across that word while they're reading, they don't have to stop their train of thought and try to figure out what it means. They've already been exposed to that word and they're familiar with it, so they can interpret it as they go. Audiobooks is really helpful. Audiobooks are really helpful for students that have executive functioning difficulty, especially with attention. They are receiving the information through multiple modalities. They're hearing it and they're seeing it. That helps them to focus, and it also helps them to take in that information. The other thing that this does for them is it gives them an example of where you're supposed to pause, where are you supposed to put emphasis on certain words, how do I add feelings to a quotation. A lot of students, when they're reading, especially if they also have a learning disorder in reading, tend to read pretty robotically. And so by listening to someone else read it, they're getting those subtle meanings from the pausing, from the inflection, from the showing of emotions that they might not get if they're reading it on their own. Again, that manipulation of the sentence structures that we talked about, putting them together, breaking them apart, doing all those activities is really going to help with comprehension. And then pairing, the other one, this last one is similar to the one I talked about first with the movies. Pairing a simple fiction text that has pictures and is more of a story structure with a more complex nonfiction topic can sometimes help the student understand that nonfiction topic better than they would if you just gave them the expository text. The last thing is there's a great program called Visualizing and Verbalizing that is produced by Linda Mood Bell that we use in our sessions sometimes with students. And what this does is it teaches students to create pictures in their minds while they're reading. And it really helps with that underlying cognitive skill of putting together that image in your mind that you can refer to help you understand. This is an example of a note-taking visual, and one of the things we use when we're explicitly teaching taking notes. We'll give them a sheet with symbols and different abbreviations that they can use and refer to and become familiar with, and then we continually use these while we're taking notes. These are some ways, sometimes it's hard to imagine how you would teach note-taking. So this is an example from the Writing Revolution that shows converting a full sentence into just the keywords and phrases. So here the task is the student needs to take this full sentence, take out anything that is like function words that don't have a lot of content to them or aren't as important, and then use those symbols. You can see that they have the symbols at the top of the page to refer to if they need them. The other reason that this is so important when it comes to writing as well is that if they can break their notes down into the shortest possible chunks with these symbols and abbreviations, they're a lot less likely to plagiarize and use someone else's words when they might have to go back and write about it, because they've left themselves with very little to work with, and they have to add in their own ideas and their own words rather than using the ones from the text. So we really want to teach kids to break down what they're seeing and only put down what's important rather than trying to take notes in full sentences and copy full sentences. The other thing I really like to encourage students to do is to take notes by hand. Anytime you're writing, it helps commit things to memory. And it, again, forces the student to think about putting it into their own words. A lot of times if students are taking notes on a computer, they're reading a text on the computer and then they have to take notes, they'll copy and paste facts or sentences from the text into their notes. That doesn't require any effort. It doesn't require them to rethink it, put it into their own words. And so they're not manipulating the information enough to really take it in. So I would highly encourage anytime we're doing note taking to do it by hand, so that we're removing that element of making it too easy or too automatic so that they're not getting that learning experience from it. Here's a couple different examples of ways that you can teach kids to take notes. The Cornell note method is tried and true. It's been around for a long time and it works. There's evidence behind it. I like this other visual too. It just gives some good tips. Use color, organize your ideas with arrows and charts. Don't make your page too busy. Don't write down every single idea. Draw pictures if it helps. Underline the things that are important. And then also reminding the students that these notes are just for them, so they need to be able to understand them. Otherwise, they're not going to be useful. And then this is a resource from Landmark College, and this gives some ideas for, on the left, you'll see some barriers to note taking or some difficulties students might have. One of these things that is relevant is a lot of our students have dysgraphia and have a really hard time with handwriting. So for those students, maybe you use a voice-to-text software so they can still take their notes in their own words, but they're talking them instead of writing them. Giving them course handouts or recorded lectures so that they can add and supplement, but they're not doing all of it on their own. And then if they have difficulty deciding what to include in their notes or selecting the main ideas, giving them some graphic organizers or taking notes as a class or reviewing notes with a teacher to make sure that they've gotten all the important information. And then if they have difficulty remembering information from lectures, that's where teachers or parents need to present the information in multiple different ways in order to make sure the student is really taking it in. And that is everything I have for reading. Any questions about executive functioning and reading?
No questions popping in right now.
Okay, awesome. Do you want me to go back in present mode? There you go.
Okay. Really small. Okay, there we go. All right, we are going to move on to oral language and how executive functioning can impact oral language. So first, what do we mean when we are saying oral language? What is that? So oral language just refers to the knowledge and skills that we use to produce and then also understand spoken language. So it's basically just speaking and then also listening and being able to understand. And I like this quote. It says, "We must consider the importance of oral language competence for successful social and academic functioning." So this quote just really tells that we need to be thinking about oral language because it's everywhere. It's in all of our social situations. It's throughout an academic day. It's in all of your students' classes. And so it's really important to consider. So when we think about social settings, if a student is on the playground talking with their peers, they need to be able to understand their peers, comprehend what they're saying. They need to be able to quickly produce a response. And then if we also think about at home socially, right, they're talking with their parents, telling them about their day. They have to be able to clearly explain themselves so that they're understood. Academics, they need to be able to understand directions from the teacher. They need to be able to understand word problems in math class. They need to be able to understand the teacher who is up there lecturing. So language is everywhere. Oral language is just so important. It's the basis for learning and social skills. So it's really important. All right, so how do executive functioning deficits impact oral language? And there are really 4 main areas that are affected. So word retrieval, listening comprehension, narrative language, and then the social situations. So we're going to dive into each 4 a little deeper. So we'll start out talking about word retrieval. So what is word retrieval? This is the ability to think of a word and then produce the correct word in a timely manner when you need it. And when students have difficulty with word retrieval, you might hear things like a lot of pauses. They might be pausing as they are trying to think of and find that word in their vocabulary. As they're trying to find that word, they also might be using a lot of fillers like and like and They also may rely on vague vocabulary. So if they're having trouble finding the very specific word that they need, they might just use a word like stuff or thing or place, right? Because those vague words could kind of cover a lot of ground, right? Versus trying to find that very specific word. They also might abandon utterances. So they might start saying a sentence and then realize that they can't find the word, so they might just give up and not finish their thought. They also might be repeating sentences over and over until they can find that word, and then they'll move on. They also might revise. So they might start saying a sentence, realize they can't find that word, and then they might revise the sentence so they don't have to use that specific word in their sentence, but they can explain it in a different way.
Just really quickly, oh, never mind.
Okay. All right, so how does executive functioning impact, right? Why are these kids having these problems? And so organization is playing a huge role here. So when we think about organization, typically we think about like external organization, like a student's backpack or a student's room might be messy or unorganized. But there's also that internal organization that Megan mentioned earlier. So where we are organizing our knowledge, our concepts, our vocabulary, our ideas, that's also an organizational skill, but it's more internal. So I'm going to give you a little example. So let's say that, oops, we just go to the wrong slide. Okay, there we go. So if we imagine a student is going upstairs to their room to look for their soccer uniform, and their room is very unorganized, it's a mess. They maybe will look in their closet first, and then they'll look in their drawers. It's not in the drawers with the other sports uniforms, and they end up finding it under their bed, and it's been 5 minutes. And then another student who maybe is much more organized goes to their room to find their soccer uniform, and it is hanging up right next to their other basketball uniform. It's right where they need it, right where they thought it would be, and they can grab it quickly. So if a student's things are organized, they can find them faster. That is very similar to vocabulary. If a student's vocabulary is organized in their brain, they can access it and use it faster than a student who has more of a disorganized language system. And so maybe these students who are fairly disorganized are having trouble connecting new words and ideas to already learned words and already learned concepts. And they're having trouble with kind of seeing these similarities and differences and being able to connect them. And so then when they go to find that word, it's not where they think it would be, and it's difficult for them to retrieve it quickly. And with these students, they may know a ton of vocabulary words. You may be able to ask them, like, what does the word impact mean? And they might be able to tell it to you. But if they want to use the word impact in everyday conversation, it might be harder and take longer for them to find it. So it's very disorganized, and so that's why they're having trouble. That's kind of confusing. Let me know if you have questions about that. Working memory also plays a role. Students need to be able to retrieve a word, keep it in their working memory as they're speaking a sentence, as they're maintaining the topic. So recalling the word and keeping it in their working memory also is playing a role. All right, so here is an example of a student who struggles with word retrieval. So this was during an evaluation. So the examiner said, tell me a story about a time when you made something. The student said, I made a present for my mom for Mother's Day. Is there anything else you want to tell me about that? No. What did you make? And the student says, it was a thing where it had like, well, it wasn't, well, I kind of forgot, but I knew that I made it. And it was something about like, I don't really remember that much about it. I just know that I made it because I know that I made it, because I wrote it on a piece of paper that I made something for my mom for Mother's Day. So this response, it's quite long, but at the end, I still don't know what the student made their mother. So they were really struggling to find the very specific words. Maybe they were looking for the word card. Maybe they were looking for a different word and they couldn't quite find it. And you see a lot of revisions, a lot of pauses, repetitions, a lot of vague words as well. So the student struggled to be able to find that word and explain things clearly here.
One of the other things that really impacts or that is part of oral language that's affected by executive functioning is listening comprehension. So successful listening comprehension or language comprehension means you have to comprehend factual details. You need to be able to make inferences when not all of the information is explicitly told to you. And then you need to be able to self-monitor if you're understanding and advocate for yourself if you're not. Oftentimes students with ADHD or executive functioning skills can comprehend facts at the same level or maybe even a higher level than their peers. They're oftentimes very intelligent, but they might have difficulty with the inferencing piece, picking out those little clues and being able to analyze them and come up with a conclusion. And they also might have trouble monitoring their comprehension. So why do students with ADHD or executive functioning deficits have difficulty with this? Again, we're going back to working memory. Oftentimes their verbal working memory is weaker than their visual. So they have a hard time keeping things that they heard in mind. They're going to benefit a lot from having visual cues or aids, especially during longer lessons in the classroom. And then attention is a huge factor in comprehension as well. If a student isn't attending to what they're hearing, it's not going to get encoded into their memory. And there's a little bit of a chicken and egg scenario here where some students are tuning out because they struggle to recall the info. They're having a hard time understanding and breaking down what they're hearing, so then they tune out. In other cases, they might start by tuning out or not attending from the beginning, and then that causes them to miss the information. Either way, attention is playing a role there. Narrative language is another thing that really is affected by executive functioning. Narrative language is basically storytelling. So it's a little bit more formal than a conversation you would have, but it's less formal than like giving a speech or presenting on a topic or what I'm doing right now. We always assess narrative language in our speech language assessments because it's a huge predictor of how students are going to do in school. Narratives have a specific structure and pattern to them. If you think about all the common stories, it starts out by introducing the characters in the setting. Some sort of problem happens. It talks about how the character's feeling about that problem. There's some sort of action plan to try to solve it. There's some sort of conclusion that it comes to, and then we often hear about the emotions again at the end of the story. As a student is exposed to more and more narratives, they start to internalize that story structure, and that's what helps them predict what's going to happen next in new stories. Telling a story requires a lot of different executive functioning skills. You need to be able to sequence. You need to be able to remember what you've already said and what you want to say next. You need to be able to use the correct grammar and sentence structure, transitions. You need to be able to have specific vocabulary. You need to be able to provide enough background information about the setting and the context so that your reader or your listener understands what you're talking about. And then you also need to have pragmatic or social skills to be able to maintain your topic, talk about the character's feelings. So there's a lot of executive functioning happening in here, even if it's a story that's as simple as, what did you do in gym class today? So the student needs to go back and remember that. They need to remember what order they did things in. They have to find the vocabulary to describe it, and they have to give you enough context so you know what they're talking about and stay on that topic without getting distracted. Students with executive functioning difficulty are going to have a hard time organizing their ideas. They might not include enough detail, or they might repeat the same details over and over. They might have trouble using specific enough vocabulary. That's where that word retrieval piece comes in. They might have trouble staying on topic. That's related to attention. And they might have trouble completing the whole story. So that's organization, that's planning, that's goal-directed persistence. And so a lot of times when we describe this narrative piece to families, they mention, yeah, when my kid comes home from school and I ask them what they did, they never can say or never can tell me what they did at school. This is an example of an 11-year-old boy who has ADHD, a specific learning disorder, and a language disorder. And you can see there's a lot of abandoned utterances. He corrects himself a lot, and it's super disorganized. So it says, I was watching my show and my mom was cooking, and Norm jumped up on the counter and grabbed a knife. He tried to play around it. One time I told me, dog, that if use your dog toys, so I'm not even going to finish the whole thing because I'm having a hard time reading it, but you can see how disorganized it is. He's jumping back and forth between details. It's not in the right sequence. I don't have enough background knowledge to know who these people are. I don't know who Norm is. By the way, I later found out that it was the dog. But you can see if he doesn't provide enough context and you're talking about he jumped up and grabbed a knife, that's confusing, kind of alarming. So this is kind of a classic example of a story that's kind trying to be constructed by somebody that has ADHD, but they're having a really hard time.
All right, we're going to move to the social impact that executive functioning deficits can have. So first, what do we mean by social language skills? What do we mean by this? So this includes tone of voice, volume of voice. It includes being able to take turns during a conversation, being able to clearly communicate your needs, your emotions, taking perspectives of others in a conversation, and then also more of the nonverbal nuances too. So eye contact, personal space, body language, using and interpreting the facial expressions. So social language is more than just the talking piece, but also that nonverbal piece too. All right, so what would it look like if a student was struggling with this? So a student with executive functioning deficits, they may blurt out the first thing that comes to their mind during a conversation, even if it's not related to the topic at all. They might be interrupting their friends during conversations. Both of these behaviors are likely due to the response inhibition difficulty. So they're having trouble kind of holding in their thoughts and kind of identifying, is this an appropriate time or do I need to wait? And they're just blurting it out. Also could be a little bit of attention. Maybe the student's not attending to the conversation. They don't even realize that other people are talking and they don't realize that they're interrupting. Students also might ask for a lot of repetitions, right? They might say things like, wait, what? Can you say that again? I missed that. And that's likely attention playing a role. They were not attending to the conversation. They were thinking about something else. Peers might become frustrated in talking with these students at times. The student might not be able to have those metacognitive skills and the flexibility skills to kind of be self-aware of how the conversation is going, how they're doing, what they need to change based on the body language or the facial expressions of their conversation partner. They might not be flexible in the topics. They might be kind of really stuck on a topic they enjoy. And so students might get frustrated with that. And they might make some inappropriate comments. And again, this is likely due to maybe some response inhibition difficulties, and also the metacognitive piece, kind of taking a step back and asking myself, where am I? Is this appropriate time to say this? How is it going to affect my audience? So these are some things you might see socially. All right, so how does oral language that is impacted by executive functioning deficits look in the classroom? One thing that might happen in the classroom is teachers may have a tough time assessing if the student has mastered or is understanding classroom content because the student might be having difficulty clearly expressing what they know and what they think. And this is where that word retrieval difficulty might come in. The student might know the answer and they really know the content, but being able to find the specific vocabulary words and then organize that, the response correctly and then produce it might be difficult for them. Also, we can go back to writing too. If they have to write something out and they don't have enough time or they're having trouble organizing their thoughts, they might not get it correct on the test and the teacher will think that maybe they don't know the content. Even if they do, maybe they're just having trouble really getting it out in a clear way. Students may not comprehend directions or verbal information during lessons like lectures. And Megan touched on that with her listening comprehension section. So they might not be attending. They might be having trouble keeping things in their working memory and comprehension might be impacted. And then students may struggle to work in groups as well because of that social impact. So they may have trouble, being flexible in the group, sharing the conversation, things like that. Great, so let's talk about some accommodations and modifications for home and school for these students. So if a student is having difficulty with listening comprehension, giving the student notes ahead of time before like a lecture-based class is going to be important. So they have something visual to help them kind of stay on track with their working memory and or their attention, or giving them notes after the class or having a note taker. Also visual instructions too for the younger students. If we are going to give a student a bunch of directions like go get your backpack, turn on your computer, and then hand in your math homework, that can be a lot for them to keep in their working memory. So giving them a Post-it with the instructions on there or a visual that they can access and kind of take a look at as they go, that's going to be really helpful too. That's going to be helpful for home as well if you're giving your student lots of directions, kind of breaking it down, giving them visuals if you can. When students are telling stories and they're really struggling to get on track and organize their thoughts, you can kind of prompt them to break it down by asking guiding questions. So if they're telling a story and you have no idea who was there or where it was, you can ask them something like, okay, was this today? Who were you with? You know, kind of ask them some closed-ended questions or even open-ended questions just to kind of get them on the right track. And then when assessing knowledge in the classroom, or even at home too, use closed-ended questions, kind of like I mentioned. So if you call on a student in class, maybe give them a closed-ended question like a yes or no, or give them options. So, you know, do you think it's this or this? And they can pick from that. Or giving a student sentence starters is good too, to kind of get their language flowing. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some intervention that we typically do during our speech language sessions. For word retrieval, we do a lot of semantic mapping. So again, word retrieval is likely happening because of a disorganized language in the student's brain. And so semantic mapping is a really good tool to make connections with other concepts and kind of group it into categories, and it'll help the students then organize their words so they can retrieve them. So these are a couple visuals that we use. The one on the left we use more for older students, the one on the right is for younger students, but they essentially are the same. So for example, if we had a word like volcano that we were learning about, we would describe the group it's in, and we would say, okay, so it's a landform. You know, where would we find it? On islands, you know, what does it do? It's lava, you know, and then as we do this, we're kind of describing all the features, and we're kind of thinking of other things too that are related. So since I know a volcano is in the group of landforms, I'm already making a connection with other landforms by kind of just describing that. When we talk more and describe more adjectives and verbs, we do a lot of synonyms and antonyms to kind of make those connections that they're organized together like that. For narrative language, we use a lot of visuals. These are the Story Champs visuals. It's a curriculum we use. And using visuals or any type of graphic organizer for narrative language is really helpful. It lays out all the important parts of a story in a sequential way so a student can better organize their thoughts. And so having these visuals, the student also is kind of more, their metacognition can be supported too. Like, did I include the setting or did I forget that part? And they can kind of monitor how they're doing. And so these visuals just kind of show the important parts of the story. And so a student would start over here with the character. So Amy was at the park, you know, and then there's the problem. And so these visuals are really helpful to help a student sequence and organize. And the point of this then is that hopefully the student will kind of start to internalize this, and this will become more automatic. Maybe this visual will pop in their head as they get used to it so that they can kind of use it on their own when they're telling stories.
Okay, we are approaching 8:30, so I'm gonna skip over this case study and instead just give you all kind of the big picture overview of what it's getting at. So this case study is about a 16-year-old who has been assessed multiple times using language assessments, which tend to be a little bit simpler, more discrete tasks, and he has always scored really high in his verbal skills. However, he has ADHD, executive functioning difficulties, and you can see his description here of what it feels like when he's trying to write. With writing and talking, too much information floods my mind at once. I don't know how to present it in a clear way. So this is a really smart kid. His IQ is super high, and he's having a really hard time communicating what he knows and representing himself at the level that he is. So the takeaway here is when we're doing assessments, we need to make sure we're building in complex tasks that they're actually going to see during their academic setting that integrate a lot of different skills, so we can try to see where that breakdown is happening and intervene on it. The other thing to keep in mind is sometimes students have had a little bit of language testing as part of their neuropsych or psychoeducational eval that came out average, and so language wasn't considered something that needed to be assessed. But if you have a student or work with a student that sounds a lot like the students we're talking about tonight, it may be worthwhile to seek a speech language assessment from somebody who is specialized in the area of executive functioning and how it relates to language, and see if there's anything that we can find and possibly intervene on to help that student. It doesn't always pop up in those neuropsychological or psychoeducational assessments that are a little bit more of a broad overview of language. And if you go to a speech language therapist and get a speech language evaluation, we can usually dig a little bit deeper and find some of those areas where things are breaking down. Anything to add there, Jeannie?
No, I think you did a great job explaining that.
Okay, so the last slides are just our references, and Joanna's going to send these to you tomorrow. Are there any questions that came in before we go, Joanna?
Yeah, there is one. It says, how do we help children that are challenged with poor executive functions realize that their tone and volume might not be appropriate?
That's a great question. So there's some different visuals out there for, like, if you've seen the zones of regulation, there's kind of red, orange, yellow, green, blue, that represent the different emotions. There's similar visuals out there for voice volume. And so you can actually create kind of a scale where maybe blue is the calm indoor voice, and then the different colors go up to a more of an inappropriate voice volume. And you can actually give the student feedback in real time and say, hey, I'm hearing that your voice is right here and we need it to be here. And the more that you can point it out in real time, the more they'll start to self-monitor that on their own. So I would say anytime that you can pair a visual with it and provide feedback as it's happening is going to be the best way to intervene. Any other questions or comments before we wrap up for the evening?
Not seeing anything coming in.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you all for joining us tonight, and I hope you have a lovely evening. Look out for those slides tomorrow. We have our emails on the cover slide, so if you have any questions about specific students, or you're wondering about an evaluation, or you look at this 5 months from now and something comes up, feel free to shoot us an email and we're happy to help.
All right, thank you, Jeannie. Thank you, Meghan. Have a good night, everybody.
You
Thank
too.
you.